So some of the things that happens are they're very famous among Civil War historians. For instance, the Confederate officer that's opposing McClellan as he lands at the tip of the peninsula, he marches the same men in a circle in front of McClellan, and the idea is that McClellan thinks that there's this huge army because he doesn't realize he's seeing the same Confederate troops marching in a circle. He thinks there's new troops. So anyway, it's very easy to fake out George McClellan. Really, that's the bottom line. So McClellan marches very slowly up the peninsula towards towards Richmond. And if he'd been aggressive, he could have captured Richmond pretty easily, but that wasn't McClellan's style. He was not aggressive. He was very passive and very overcautious. And what he did was he allowed the Confederate Army and Confederate troops to somewhat regain the initiative, or he allows them to establish defensive lines. I think that's maybe a better way to put it. And so he's moving up, and then very by about the end of May of 1862. McClellan gets so close to Richmond as the Confederate Army keeps on falling back, but in a very orderly fashion. It's not a rout or anything because McClellan's moving so slowly that, the story has it that the Union Army could actually hear the church bells of Richmond. That's how close that they were to Richmond. But it's at that point things go haywire for McClellan. At one of the what was called the Battle of the 7 Days, there were seven. There were a number of battles over a week period, and this is actually where this course is not going. I'm not going to describe these battles in detail. It's pretty not mind-numbing for me, and I just don't think it's that interesting for you as well. I'll describe some campaigns, but I'm not going to describe this one. But here's the key takeaway points. At the Battle of the 7 Days, a couple of things happen. First of all, the Confederate commander, a guy by the name of Joe Johnson, gets wounded. He's wounded. And Robert E. Lee is appointed commander of Confederate forces in his place. Lee had not had a great civil war up until that point. Actually, Lee was the Confederate that McClellan had kind of checkmated in the western part of Virginia. Jefferson Davis had a lot of respect for Lee, and he called him back to Richmond as kind of a military liaison. But as soon as this guy Joe Johnson is injured at the first day of the Battle of the 7 Days, Lee becomes the commander. This is a turning point in the history of the Civil War because although I don't think Lee is such a great strategic thinker, he is maybe the most brilliant tactical fighter in the history of the U.S. military. You would have not wanted to go against Robert E. Lee in a battle. He was very audacious. Unlike McClellan, he was very aggressive. He had the complete loyalty of his men. He had a number of very able officers under him. And time and time again, Lee pulls out these miraculous victories over the Union Army. Although, let me say once again that the Confederacy is never able to capitalize on these victories because what you're going to be hearing about for the next couple of weeks is, at least in the Eastern Theater, well, the Union Army was defeated. The Union Army was defeated. At Gettysburg, the Union Army wins, and then there's more defeats. But the key thing is that the Confederates did not have the capacity, it did not have the army, it did not have the power to capitalize on these victories to defeat the Union. Really, the only way the Confederacy could have defeated the Union, there were two ways. One of the ways the Confederacy could have defeated the Union, and everyone knew this, was to erode the public opinion in the North, to turn public opinion in the North against the fight. This is, to a certain extent, what happened to the United States in Vietnam in the 1960s and the 1970s. Public opinion got fed up with the war in Vietnam, and we ultimately withdrew, although it's a much more complicated story than that. Um, so anyway, so that would be a number one way the Confederacy could win this thing. Because remember, the Confederacy doesn't have to capture 1 inch of territory to win the Civil War. All they need to do is persuade the Union to let them go. Okay, so that's number one way the Confederacy can win this thing. Number two, and related to that to a certain extent, was to bring Europe into the war, especially England and especially France. But England's really the big player here. Now you might wonder, okay, why Europe? Why is Europe an important variable here? Well, it wasn't like the Confederates thought that the British, and to a lesser extent the French, would ever send troops into North America. But what they wanted was, with recognition, and actually what they expected when the war began, because of the whole King Cotton idea, the idea that the economies of Great Britain and France were dependent on cotton, they expected this. And this is the huge disappointment of the Confederacy in the Civil War, and the huge surprise that cotton just did not turn out to have the leverage that Confederates, the Southern slaveholders, were positive it had before the Civil War. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, there was an oversupply of cotton in Great Britain. They had bought a lot of cotton and they'd stored it, so there was cotton there. So they don't feel the pinch initially. Another thing, a little bit later in the war, the working classes in Great Britain, even though many of them were laid off, were very, very anti-Confederate and very, very pro-Union. So anyway, the big story is King Cotton doesn't play the role that Confederates were sure it was going to play in bringing England and France into the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. Okay, so what could Europe have done? Well, there's a couple of things. Lincoln had imposed a blockade on southern ports right after the war began, and it didn't completely stop the flow of goods out and into the Confederacy. It was a very leaky blockade. You know, the coast of the South, it stretches all the way from northern Virginia all the way down to Brownsville, Texas. And there was quite a bit of smuggling, what was called privateering, going on, especially in North Carolina. Very, very friendly coastline to kind of these privateers, these smugglers. And so there's goods coming in and out of the Confederacy, but the blockade does significantly retard trade between the Confederacy and Europe. It doesn't stop it completely, but it really does make a huge dent into it. So what the Confederates were thinking is the British Navy in particular, if the British joined on the side of the Confederacy, would come and they would force the Union, the British Navy would, to stand down its blockade. Okay, that would not have been a small thing. That would have been a big thing. The other thing is recognition. The Confederacy, if it was recognized as a sovereign nation, an independent nation, if it had that official recognition, which it did not after the at any point during the Civil War. During the Civil War, Great Britain recognized the Confederacy and France as a belligerent power, that there were two warring parties, but Great Britain never recognized the Confederacy as an independent nation separate from the United States. Okay, this is a huge deal, and it was a huge deal at the time. If Europe had recognized the Confederacy as a separate and independent nation, then the Confederacy could have gotten loans. It would have had a lot more, much higher profile on the world stage. It would have had enormous clout among the family of nations if it had been recognized not merely as a belligerent or as a rebellion, but if it had been recognized as a sovereign country of its own. But the British were never willing to take that step. It was too much. And one of the reasons that the British aren't, and this is something that the Doyle book talks a lot about, is that the Lincoln administration told the British, if you recognize the Confederacy, we're going to war with you. We will set the world on fire. This will create a world war. Um, and so Lincoln manages to stave off Confederate recognition. Now, the last thing I'll say in this podcast, Lincoln did have a card to play, and that's Canada. We don't often think about Canada, but at that point, is hopefully you know, the Canada was a dominion, was still controlled by the British. It wasn't an independent country. So Lincoln and Seward left not so subtle hints that if the British came in on the side of the Confederacy, if the British Navy tried to break up the blockade, if Great Britain recognized the Confederacy as an independent nation, a sovereign nation, that the Union forces would cross into Canada and attack Canada and grab Canada from Great Britain. So the Union did have some cards to play. So anyway, so this is what's going on. This is kind of why the question of recognition is so important.